Melanoma Matters is an educational resource. The content represents our opinions and does not constitute medical advice. If you're a patient with questions specific to your situation, please consult your medical practitioner.
Hey everybody, welcome to Melanoma Matters. I'm Sapna Patel.
I'm James Larkin. Hi.
Today we wanted to just have a discussion about the Nadina data. And we heard from Christian Blank in an earlier episode about the actual clinical trial results, and now we wanted to talk about putting it into practice. But before we do that, we'll do quickfire, icebreaker, however we call it. So I was thinking, because I come across this a lot, about telling us your number, James, not that number, which, by the way, is its own conversation, why people even ask that. But I hear people talk about the number of countries they've been to. Have you ever counted?
No.
Yeah.
Have
Me
you?
neither. No. And I was asking for almost that same reason about the other what's your number. Why on earth would you count this? Because then all you do is you're keeping a running like list or log in your head. What does it matter if you've been to 10 countries or 20 or 30, right? It's just exploring. But people will say, I've been to 65. I don't even know how many countries there are in the world. I could fact check that.
It's about 180, I think, isn't it?
Oh.
No, I think it's about 180. You could look at the Olympic Games league table and scroll all the way down to the bottom, right? Accepting that not every... Sorry?
Those are countries with athletes.
Yeah, but it ends up being most of the countries in the world, actually, I think, although there are some countries that aren't at the Olympic Games. Yeah, but this kind of, to me, it just reminded me of this whole thing, and I'm afraid it's a bit of a US stereotype, the people who kind of, quote unquote, do Europe. So doing Europe would be like 2 or 3 days in Rome, 2 or 3 days in Paris, 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 days in London. We've done it, tick. Yeah. But it's the same point, isn't it? Actually, maybe it's nice just to spend a bit of time in one place. And
that's why I don't
get to know it a little bit.
That's why I don't care for this log or tally. Who cares what the number is? It's like, do you have an experience that you remember that you put in to your memory bank? Anyway, well, good to know you haven't counted either. Okay, so Nadina, so tell me, I presume you've seen the presentation now, you've heard from Christian, you've read the paper, you've read the supplementals. What is your take on this trial of, some 300 patients or so? I can't even remember now how many patients. Was it 300, 400? We can look that up, but tell me your take on it and if you're using it.
Okay, so first and foremost, fantastic work, and we said that to Christian at the time, Christian and colleagues. I see it honestly first and foremost as being confirmatory, actually, of S1801 and of all the previous work that Christian had done. Right. And I think, practically speaking, that's the number one, and I don't think you can argue with that at all. Maybe the other things I would then start to pick out, and Christian would be the first person to say this, is the relatively short duration of follow-up, around about 10 months, something like that. So obviously we'll need more, and we will get more mature data. But nevertheless, I mean, it was great to see such a clear result after a short period of time. And then I guess the other two big headings I think are interesting to discuss would be contribution of components and sequence in that trial. In other words, where do we think the heavy lifting is taking place, which I think, academically is an important question. And then I suppose finally, this was a trial that was done rightly and understandably at a relatively small number of well set up centres in the Netherlands and Australia, and that's great. But particularly with the pathology is what I'm thinking about here, because I think one of the key differences, I think, for trying to operationalize this in the future using clinical practice is that one of the nice things about S1801 is that although you do the path review, it actually doesn't change what you do. And
Right.
so actually, it's kind of applicable pretty much immediately in clinical practice. Whereas actually the path review that you would need to do per Nadina to stop people's treatment if they have a good response, to change them to BRAF targeted therapy if there's an insufficient response. Without question, I think rolling that out, countrywide, let's say, certainly here anyway, is not necessarily a minor issue. It takes time, takes training, takes resources, and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, I guess those would be my headlines. What do you think?
Very much saying, yes. I mean, first of all, massive congratulations. We've been hearing about this data, I think, as Jeff Weber said to us, the worst kept secret on the planet when it was clearly going to be a positive trial. And it's really confirmatory of all the work that Christian's done on his end. Whether it confirms S1801 or not, they're just different studies, different regimens, but it certainly really clearly lays out the case for neoadjuvant therapy. I remember when we were presenting the S1801, just looking for the slides here, but when we were presenting that, you gave us a little grief in the discussion about not enrolling to 500. And similarly, I think this study had, planned to enroll a larger sample size, but they stopped at, we'll get the final number here. It's probably not critical to have it right on hand, but maybe you can explain why the number enrolled is potentially less important in a study like this. We say we want to enroll 500 patients. In both of these studies, we were roundabout saying we'll enroll 500 patients. But in neither study did we get all the way to 500. But I mean, that's not really a flaw of this. That's actually the way these studies are designed, right? They're event driven.
Yeah. And, at the end of the day, both studies, in my view, there's this whole thing, is it phase 2, phase 3 randomized? But at the end of the day, they're adequately sized, randomized trials where there's a large effect, right? So obviously you can do enormous studies and you can look for smaller effects. But, as you probably said before, you could drive a bus or the equivalent between those curves. So actually, why would you really want to have a larger randomized trial anyway in the first place is what I think. And I guess the practical explanation of this is going to come back to the event-driven nature of the study. So I'm pretty relaxed about that, actually. And in many ways, I would say it in terms of, let's say, resources, if you like, that it's absolutely acceptable to me to do, relatively smaller randomized studies. And actually then we can maybe think about moving on to the next question. I mean, there's some regulatory issues which are separate in a sense, and maybe it's worth us saying something about that as well. But in terms of the science, if you like, and demonstrating new findings, I think enough has been done, actually.
Yeah. With a study, so it looks like they got 423 ultimately randomized here after screening 485. So by the way, I was glad to see they had kind of a ineligible rate similar to what we saw in the SWOG study. So 423, when both of the studies were planning around about 500, it just means that when you design a study statistically, you're saying, this is our endpoint that we're looking for. We're looking for this magnitude of improvement between our two arms. In order to reach that, and we think the average median time is a better word, but the median time to recurrence, which is really the main event in these neoadjuvant and adjuvant trials, but not the only event, the median time is this. So if we think it's this, and all you can do is base that on an adjuvant trial that has kind of a later push point of recurrence, because you don't see any of those early recurrences because those patients were not eligible for adjuvant therapy. So you think that your time is going to be out there at 2 or 3 years for a median, recurrence. Maybe not that far, but, past a year mark. You say, I want this magnitude of difference. And that tells you, okay, if it's going to take that long to have events, then this is the sample size you're going to need to meet that difference with adequate power. And so all that sample size means is you enroll to that number. But then what the statisticians are actually calculating is you need, in the case of the SWOG study, we needed 105 events. Well, 105 events between the two arms will detect a magnitude of difference with adequate power. But that didn't matter if you had 500 patients enrolled. It's as soon as you hit the events. And so similarly, they had an event number here where once they hit it, they didn't need to keep enrolling. And then you stop enrolling. The idea is that that enrollment number represents a maximum, so that in the course of the study, if your events are slower than assumed by the statisticians and the study designers, if your events come in slower, then you stop at that enrollment number and you just let the study mature, and events will come after enrollment, like basically after. In both of these studies, the events came in early, mainly driven by the adjuvant arm, as you can imagine. And so because those events came in early, you actually didn't have to enroll to your maximum. You could stop because of event driven. It's a minor point, but maybe not that minor, because I know that was sort of a critique back in the day. And now I think we understand in event driven studies, the enrollment simply represents a maximum enrollment. It doesn't represent study conduct issues when you don't enroll to that number. It just means your events came in faster than you imagined. And in neoadjuvant trials, we didn't know what that timeline looked like before. Right. So now we have evidence that neoadjuvant single agent is better than an adjuvant approach, single agent PD-1. And now this Nadina regimen, which is low dose IPI and higher dose Nivo, for 2 doses might be sufficient in quite a lot of melanoma patients, then absolutely no adjuvant in them. And that regimen seems to be superior to the adjuvant arm, although that's also combined with the 30 or 40% of patients who went on to adjuvant therapy, but they had some PD-1 or BRAF/MEK in the adjuvant setting. Altogether, that group received neoadjuvant, and the sum of those parts is that neoadjuvant combination is superior to adjuvant PD-1. But we are really struggling with regulatory approval. Neither of these regimens really have regulatory approval in the US, but we can put them in guidelines. So in the US, we can access these. It's a little more challenging to get commercial reimbursement, but you end up saying, look, there's randomized data to support it, and often you can get the commercial payers to pay. In Australia, of course, they have approval and reimbursement for neoadjuvant single agent PD-1. Same in the Netherlands, Ireland, a handful other places. They're working towards getting this Nadina regimen. But in the UK, what is it like practically? And in most of mainland Europe, what would it be like practically to get reimbursement for a neoadjuvant regimen? And then if you could, which regimen? Could you actually put any of these in practice, or are you struggling from, the need for a proper registrational approval?
Yeah, so we can't really get reimbursement without regulatory approval is the short answer to that. There are some sort of work or potential workarounds to that, but the short answer is, and this is the same, it's true for most places, that regulatory approval is necessary to consider reimbursement. So that's where we are at the moment, certainly on the NHS in this country. With private patients in this country, this is going to be people who have insurance, and that's maybe 5 or 10% of people at most. The reimbursement environment is a bit more permissive, shall we say, and maybe pragmatic. So then if you look at S1801, and we've talked about this before, but it's an important point, you've got the same amount of treatment, the patient's having an operation either way around, and so then, because effectively it's financially neutral, then that outside the NHS is potentially reimbursable for private payers. But the NHS very much tied to the regulatory situation, which is the case almost everywhere. So that's really why we need some sort of regulatory approval here. And just remember, I probably talked about this before, but we're talking about using anti-CTLA-4 here, per Nadina, in a stage 3 setting. There's no precedent for that from a regulatory perspective, right? So in the US maybe, and maybe this is a bad example, but IPI-10 was approved for adjuvant melanoma. So at least there's experience, if you like, kind of memory of anti-CTLA-4, as we don't even have that at all.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, let's say, we do get regulatory approval and we get reimbursement as well. The other bit for us is going to be the piece about training up the pathologists at every centre where melanoma is treated. And so here, it's maybe 50 places just even in England, or between 30 and 50, and they're not all big centres, to be quite honest. So you can't use a Nadina regimen without having gold standard pathology review. Otherwise, you're underserving the patients. It's as simple as that. So that's another piece that needs to be thought through pretty carefully, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's right there. So for a private patient, could you use the Nadina regimen, or even because there's no precedent for IPI in this stage 3 setting, that would be difficult for you to reimburse?
It would be difficult, basically, but probably partly because of the anti-CTLA-4. Sometimes, and I hesitate to say this in public, a lot of these things are looking at drop-down menus. Does this drug have an approval in this setting? And if the computer says no, as the expression goes, then whereas single agent anti-PD-1, by that dint is straightforward.
So, I mean, it's no, I guess the point's not lost on me that the 1801 regimen is easier in that way. I mean, it was something that we thought about because, the argument can now be said, if you were planning to give adjuvant PD-1, if that was your plan with this patient, stepping back, they'll go to surgery, I'll give them a year, then just give them those 18 doses, just give it in this fashion, right? So if you're planning to give it, then just give it this way. That's really the key. Nadina actually goes in a massively important way. It gives you a much more cost-effective regimen when you think about it's 2 doses without the adjuvant. It really can save a lot of money, resources, time. But it has this hurdle of the comparison, maybe not all the contribution of components like you were mentioning. And there was a conversation with 1801. Well, what if we said you give 3 doses on top of a full year of adjuvant? And so now the adjuvant arm would receive 18 doses. The neoadjuvant arm would receive 3 plus 18. So 3 in front of surgery and then a full 18. And the only concern that I had there, because that seems really clean. It seems like the contribution of components there would clearly be these 3 neoadjuvant doses. But my concern was if the margin of benefit was narrow, the magnitude of benefit was small, then cost could come into it. And then people would say those 3 added doses doesn't really, for the quality adjusted life years that you gain, doesn't really make sense to add this to our regimen because it's too expensive to get you whatever that marginal benefit is. So, I am glad we didn't do 3 plus 18. We just did 18 in total and just how we split it up. That allows for some even thoughtfulness of saying, should we say 2 doses of anti-PD-1? Could you, we've talked about the UPenn data that was 1 dose of anti-PD-1. And then we've also talked about, we've had this conversation at SWOG. I don't know what you think about this, but CTLA-4 we know is dose responsive. So we know, 10 milligrams, like you said, in the adjuvant setting, but we know in metastatic data, 10 milligrams better than 3, better than 1, better than 0.3, better than 0.1 milligrams per kilogram. PD-1, not so dose responsive. PD-1's a lot more, it locks into that receptor, and then, that's it. We don't think you're getting much more by changing the dose. So, with a PD-1 regimen, could we play around with the number of doses? Is that something important that we should be doing? Or is that 2 or 3 doses, which, by the way, is a dose at week 0, a dose at week 3, a dose at week 6, according to the SWOG regimen, and then surgery between week 7 and 12. Or if you gave 2 doses, a dose at week 0, a dose at week 3, you could let that full cycle of second dose pembro play out and again do surgery week 7, 6, 7, 8, something like that. I think most surgeons are okay operating soon after single agent PD-1. Nadina was 2 doses and then surgery between week 7 and 12. Is it important to play around with the dose with single agent PD-1? And then with Nadina, the question that really comes up is, if we know IPI is dose responsive, does it make sense to give 2 IPI doses at this 1 milligram, or should you just give them a strong CheckMate 067 dose, single dose of IPI3 and Nevo? I mean, it's a biology question. We don't know how it plays out, I think.
I mean, these are all important questions, but I mean, and there's all sorts of different questions, right, that could be looked at. But I think that kind of, honestly, I think the biggest unmet need here is probably the people who aren't really getting benefit from the treatment that we're using already. That's where I think I'd really focus with new approaches, anti-LAG3, for example. There's interest in vaccines, that type. So if I was prioritizing, that's what I'd be prioritizing, I think. And as ever, my concern, we talked about this a lot before, with going up on your IPI dose is going up on your toxicity at the same time, and then steroid usage as well, almost inevitably. And it might be that, you end up using a load of steroids in that situation. And let's say if in the future you were doing something differently post-operatively based on what had happened already, biopsies or whatever else, having a load of patients on loads of steroids might not be ideal in that situation. So I'm just sort of slightly worried about that as well. And I guess the other thing to say, and I was going to say, when we're talking about regulatory approval, and we haven't really mentioned it, there's actually quite a lot of industry activity really now in this space with trials. Yeah. Oh, hopefully, which it would be great, and I think it would be complementary to all the work that's been done so far, resulted in regulatory approval and potential reimbursement as well. Because it's frustrating, honestly, in clinic to see the amazing data, and the patients all know about it, and they all come and talk to it, and then we just say, look, really sorry, and then we have to have a long discussion about kind of regulatory approval and reimbursement, which, to be blunt, isn't really what I want to be spending time doing with my patients, but it's what we have to do.
Right. I think, like you said, the patients who are not benefiting is a place where we can focus. And we know a portion of patients benefit from single agent PD-1. We know that doublet adds to that. There's even more patients who benefit from 1801. So you get an extra group of patients under control where single agent would not have been enough. And then you're left with a small group of patients for whom even that doublet wasn't enough. And so Christian's always been very generous about this in saying that if single agent is enough, let's find the biomarker to tell us that. The biomarker that might say, okay, we gave you doublet and now we have changed you into a more responsive tumor. And then for the ones who are non-responsive, is it triple therapy? Is it the addition of cytokine? Is it, intralesional? What else could we do to those? So biomarker development really becomes important here. And it's the question of whether we're looking at that baseline sample, the on-treatment sample after a dose or two. So is whatever we're starting with augmenting? If not, we build on that. And we have to remember that most of these are stage 3. So we're talking about clinically positive lymph nodes. But in a portion of patients, there may be some people where that primary tumor is still intact, and that's being looked at. But I think, as we discussed with Christian, I think he was telling us that the majority of this biomarker work is done on the lymph node specimen, right? So that's important that we remember that lymph node is probably holding the valuable information. It's the most regional. But then let me bring you back to this pathology thing, because what you said is really critically important. In the 1801 type of regimen, the pathology is nice to have, but it doesn't dictate what you do. But then obviously we could be over treating. And as you've said in a past episode, that's the definition of adjuvant therapy. Of course you're over treating. If we knew who needed the therapy, it really wouldn't be adjuvant therapy. In Nadina, they're trying to refine it and get us closer to who needs it. So they're basically saying, if you have a gold star pathologist, maybe gold stars, I mean, that means something different in every scenario, but if you have a gold star pathologist who can really read this for you, that allows you to potentially lean in and do better in the adjuvant setting, potentially drop therapy, minimize, surveillance. But that's really hinging upon this pathologist. So what 1801 certainly taught us is when you do this across multiple centers in the United States, and you have each individual pathologist with the protocol that tells you, please section the tissue this way, process it this way, read it this way, do the math this way, the maths this way. You know, even then, and then we had a central pathology reviewer, there's a big learning curve between the local sites and the central. Nadina, as you mentioned, done at more refined, experienced hospitals. They really leaned into the training of those, as we did in SWOG too. You know, we had guidance, but, you know, 95 sites enrolled, you can only do so much with those. We were open at 600 or 800 different hospitals. With Nadina, opened at, you know, a dozen places in Australia and the Netherlands, and then a single couple of places in the US. The central pathology review matched the local review. There was very good concordance. So it tells you training is possible. You can definitely train. But now we're talking about training up, scaling that to the world, right? To all of UK centers, to all of the US, Canada, South America, all of mainland Europe. So what that looks like, I'm not clear yet. How do we get all of this excellent pathology data into a training set, digitized, a training set, something that these pathologists can teach themselves? And then we have to actually adjust the reimbursement that we give pathologists, because now it's no longer a 5-minute quick read, take this lymph node specimen, tell me if it's positive or negative. It's do the maths on this specimen, be really intricate with it, because what you're telling me, I can do one of 2 or 3 inflection points with that patient. And that, you know, that pathology time needs to be acknowledged and noticed. Anyway, I don't know that I have a question in there, just a lot of comments, right?
No, but that's all important stuff, I think. And, you know, I think the whole discussion, I mean, it's great to have Christian on and talk to him as well, but then for us to think a little bit about, you know, what this might look like and what the obstacles we face in clinic with our patients. I think it's a useful discussion. Is there anything else we haven't said, do you think? Is that everything?
Yeah, we should have a conversation about this recent FDA ODAC vote that came out. So Oncologic Drug Advisory Committee voted, I think 11-0 the other day, about neoadjuvant designs for US review and approval by the FDA. Do you feel well versed enough to kind of speak on what that looked like?
Yeah, well, you pointed it out to me, thank you. And I went away and read it. And then this was just the date, I guess, is going to be the end of July. I can't remember the exact date, maybe the 25th or 26th of July, 2024. And it was with reference actually to a non-small cell lung cancer trial called AEGEAN with durvalumab. And, you know, my takeaway from reading that, apart from the unanimous vote, was really the confusion to some extent about some of these data sets, because the trials, weird echo. You got that or not?
No. Okay, yeah. The other thing is about this FDA vote that happened recently with ODAC, their Oncologic Drug Advisory Committee. I think it was an 11-0 vote in favor of a little more specifications around neoadjuvant trial design. So do you feel comfortable enough with that vote to be able to explain it or describe it?
Yeah, I can try. Obviously, you pointed it out to me anyway, so I went away and I looked it up. But this was 25th, 26th of July, I think, 2024, and mainly in reference to a non-small cell lung cancer trial called AEGEAN with durvalumab in it. And the crux of it really was exactly the issue that we've been talking about, really, the potential difficulties of isolating contribution of components. That's one thing, but also critically, they call it contribution of phase, I think is the exact phraseology that they use. Or you could call that combination.
They do that because people like you like to abbreviate contribution of components as COX, and they don't want people running around saying the COX of the FDA. So now it's the COPS of the FDA.
Oh, really?
I don't know.
I suppose I'd sort of taken them differently, though, because I mean, I think the sort of critical thing with neoadjuvant isn't just the treatment, it's the timing of the treatment, basically. And that's what they're trying to disentangle. And I think what I took away from that vote and that guidance was the fact that this question or questions, these questions need to be explicitly addressed in trial design, and that trials potentially need to have multiple arms to really try to get at some of these issues. You know, what is it that has resulted in benefit? Is it the time that you give the treatment, or is it the treatment itself, and so on and so forth? So I actually thought that was pretty timely advice, and it's an interesting area. And I think my sense is that if they've taken that view on a lung cancer trial, it'd be quite surprising if in due course that they didn't take a similar view, you know, on trials in different areas with neoadjuvant. And I'd also be surprised if other regulators didn't follow suit, actually. But anyway, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I mean, you even kicked off our conversation sort of saying it in your CrossFit way, like what's doing the heavy lifting here? You know, is it the regimen itself? Is it the timing of the regimen, the duration? Is it the neoadjuvant plus the adjuvant phase? Just the neoadjuvant? Does the adjuvant add in somebody without an excellent response? So I think all of those are leading the FDA to say, in order for us to tease out the different contributions, we are going to need to see different phases of care and different arms so that we can tease that. And basically, what happened with the AEGEAN? What happened with the vote?
Oh, in terms of the approval of the study, yes, they gave a negative, I think, on that, right? And then I think there was some disquiet that other previous similar trials hadn't had the same result. And I guess that, you know, to use a phrase, put the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit. But on the other hand, actually, you know, sometimes that kind of thing does happen. And actually, it's good, in my view anyway. It's unfortunate in a way, but it's good that it's been recognised, because I think it then sets a direction of travel or a template, at least for the future. So I hope it kind of sticks, actually.
What animal got stuck with the pigeons, did you say?
Cat. Do you not have that? The cat amongst the pigeons. Do you? No? You
No.
don't have that expression at all? Really? Yeah.
Is that like canary in the coal mine? No, that's different. Canary in the coal mine and cat.
No, it's just the idea. Can you imagine if you've got like a flock of pigeons or something like that in Trafalgar Square, like, you know, eating tourists are feeding them, and then you put a cat in the middle? I mean, you know, what do you think would happen? Be messy, right?
Okay, messy. Got it. All right, good. Well, I think that's a great discussion of Nadina real world. Such an amazing study. So good to see it out there with a concomitant publication in New England. That was a lovely moment to see that as well. Congrats to that team, to the field in general. And now we've got to go onwards and upwards.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so this is a fact check for Nadina, episode 26, and we were talking about 27. Thank you. Let's not redo it though. Anyway, and I think we did that in June, and we're now in September. July. Thank you. Double fact check. And anyway, the thing was that on the 15th of August, the FDA actually approved durvalumab with platinum-containing chemotherapy as neoadjuvant treatment, followed by single-agent durvalumab as adjuvant treatment for adults with resectable non-small cell lung cancer, basically. So that's the issue. We were talking about some of the points, I guess, that the ODAC made at the meeting. And for the detail on that, Sapna, I will hand over to you.
So the issue is, in episode 27, in the sort of tail end, what we end up calling a fact check, we talk about that ODAC vote at the end of July. It was July 24th, 25th, something like that. ODAC votes to now require essentially contribution of components and contribution of phases in these kind of future design trials. And that was stemmed on their review of this AEGEAN trial. And I think we end up saying, you know, I asked you what was the outcome. We say it's negative, but actually at that point they hadn't voted on AEGEAN yet. So they end up voting on it on August 15th, and they end up voting favorably to approve perioperative durvalumab. But the issue, I think, for those that know this space, this study, and this field well, is that AEGEAN had perioperative durvalumab that was better than perioperative chemo. And so the question was, which of those phases of care, was it the neoadjuvant or the adjuvant or both, contributed to this positive signal in the study? It's hard to tease apart because the study had both. Versus, was it the components? Was it the durvalumab plus the chemotherapy? There is no durvalumab alone in this study. And so they really are having a hard time knowing the contribution of components, although you could argue you've got chemotherapy in both arms. No, do you? Durvalumab or placebo with chemo? Yeah. So you've got chemo in both arms. You've got one with durvalumab, one without. You could try to say, if you looked at just the neoadjuvant phase, you could maybe see the component contribution there. But again, their point is the study had both neoadjuvant and adjuvant. Did these patients get over treatment? In other words, was neoadjuvant durvalumab plus chemo all you needed? And you just can't tell in a study like this. So AEGEAN was positive. They did get a positive approval based on this, so perioperative durvalumab. But in the future, the FDA is basically saying 2-arm trials is insufficient to tell us the contribution of phases, COPs, and the contribution of components, COCs, COCs. So it's insufficient to tell us that with just 2 arms. You are going to have trials that are multi-arm, that separate just out the neoadjuvant part, just the component part. Anyway, so that really has trial implications. We should think about that in the melanoma space, obviously the kidney cancer space, lung cancer, moving forward. What does that mean when ODAC is now saying 2 arms is not enough? And so just a cautionary tale of any trials that are ongoing in this space, that this is getting a closer look now.
Yeah, agreed. And also I think for trial design, I mean, in kidney cancer, for example, there's still a lot of discussion about how you should design neoadjuvant trials in all sorts of different ways, actually. Not for now, but this has a definite bearing on that. So,
and really lovely that we did it on the end of Nadina, right? Because Nadina was thinking in this direction. They said, we're going to just give you the neoadjuvant phase of care. And for people who do well, nothing else. I think the FDA will probably say we needed to have a comparison that if you do really well, you get randomized to adjuvant, no adjuvant. That will show them the contribution of phases. Nevertheless, I think cool that Nadina was already sort of putting us in this headspace.
Yeah, agreed.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.